4 Israelis rescued, 270 Palestinians killed, and no ceasefire deal yet. The headlines may be bad, but this is playing out pretty much exactly as Benjamin Netanyahu wants it to. In Jordan, you're on dangerous ground if you accuse the state of complicity with Israel. And Giorgia Meloni's domination over Italy's public broadcaster Rai is leaving very little room for critical journalism. Through the more than 8 months of the war in Gaza, one issue, above all else, has obsessed much of Israeli society. It's the hostages. On news bulletins, in polls, in the national consciousness, the fate of the Israelis held as prisoners of war in Gaza is a big story. Around 120 out of the approximately 240 abducted by Hamas fighters on October 7th remain in captivity. The dramatic extraction of 4 of them in an Israeli army operation has made some things starkly evident. First, a ceasefire is the most effective process to rescue hostages. A deal in November freed 105 Israelis. Second, Palestinian lives will be sacrificed in any rescue. More than 270 were massacred in the recent assault. And third, politically the most vital point in Israel right now is that for Prime Minister Netanyahu, the hostage matter is something he pays lip service to, but it's a headache. It gets in the way of what seems to be Netanyahu's effort to prolong this war in order to prolong his own political career.
4 חטופים שלנו, שהמשפחות שלהם כבר באמת חשבו על הנורא מכל זאת, ופתאום לראות אותם כאן, על הרגליים, בריאים ושלמים.
It was a day of high emotion in Israel. After being held for nearly 250 days in captivity in Gaza, 4 Israeli hostages had been extracted by the army. Operation Seeds of Summer, the code name initially given to the hostage rescue campaign, was celebrated across Israel. The jubilation was not just about the return of captives kidnapped by Hamas fighters during the October 7th attack. It was about the reassertion of Israel's military might.
עם ישראל כולו זוכים להיות גם חלק מרגעים כאלה של התעלות, של הצלחה, של ישראליות, צריך להגיד.
אני חושב שעם שלם בוכה יחד איתך עכשיו.
The operation was hailed as proof that despite its catastrophic failure to protect the nation 8 months ago, the army was back in control.
I think it's important to harken back to Israel's mythology of its own strength. I mean, since the beginning of Israel's inception, Israel has built itself through its military hammer.
As the new Jewish state is born, Arab strongpoints are taken after being blasted to rubble.
This line of Israeli operations that are daring, creative, sublime, has been a fundamental and important element in the production of Israeli identity itself. So this operation had these elements. But at the same time, we should remember that it accompanied a whole-scale massacre of 270 Palestinians, another 600 injured. But of course, in Israeli own narrative, it only included the rescue operation without any significant mention of the massacres that the Israeli army inflicted on the Palestinian civilians in the camp.
The military correspondents gave greatly detailed accounts recounting the drama of the rescue.
קצין בכיר מאוד שאנחנו משוחחים איתו היום, והיה שותף לכמה מבצעים מאוד מאוד גדולים בהיסטוריה של צה"ל, אומר שמבצע נועז כזה הוא לא ראה.
The IDF released some quite dramatic body camera footage, but it does seem like a one-off, I think, even to people who are excited about it. There's a recognition that this sort of thing is not replicable.
Already the hostage situation has dragged on much longer than Israelis have wanted. There are 120 captives still remaining in Gaza. At least a third of them have reportedly been killed in Israeli airstrikes.
יש עוד 120 חטופים שממשלת ישראל צריכה להגיע עבורם לעסקה.
The families of the hostages have come together to become one of the most persistent pressure groups on the Israeli government. At every stage of this war, the hostage families have criticized, lamented, and berated what they call a self-serving leadership. And across Israel, the cause of the hostages has popular sympathy and support.
Every single interaction you have in Israel has something to do with the hostages. When I tried on a blouse in a boutique, there was a poster in the changing cabin that said, "Bring them home now." Every single shop window has the stencil, hashtag "Bring them home now." Bring them home now was the Wi-Fi password at a cafe I work at in Tel Aviv. There are pictures of the hostages taped to park benches, plastered on walls. Everyone knows all their names.
The hostage issue is very emotive for Israelis, as it would be for any people in the world. If their people are taken hostage, they would want them back. The problem for Netanyahu is that the war effort to free the hostages is not succeeding. They had just freed 4 the other day with this very vicious raid, but the only ones that were released when there was a ceasefire.
I don't think it's controversial to say that returning the hostages has not been a priority for the Netanyahu government. When Netanyahu announced the ultimate aims of this war, which were returning the hostages and then total victory, as he claimed it over Hamas, it's been pretty clear that his administration has pursued the latter. The hostage families have been protesting almost every week. They don't seem to have made very much of an impact on Netanyahu or, for that matter, the ministers in his government. For instance, Minister Benjamin, who is the national security minister, was caught on camera. There's an animosity, actually, to some of the hostage families. It's been quite shocking.
In the long months that Israel's relentless assault on Gaza has dragged on, the families of the hostages have taken it upon themselves to keep the cause of their loved ones in the public eye.
אנחנו כאן כדי לדאוג להחזיר את עניין השבת החטופים כמטרה עליונה במלחמת חרבות ברזל.
Since the rescue mission, Israeli news outlets have gone wall to wall, day after day, with news of the evacuees.
A lot has been made of the fact in Israeli media that these hostages appear to have been held in civilian homes. And of course that bolsters the common Israeli narrative that there's no uninvolved people in Gaza, which is to say that all Gazans are participants in what Hamas is doing. At the same time, a lot of hostages have openly said that they certainly feared for their lives from their captives, but what they also feared was that they might be killed in Israeli airstrikes, that they could hear the bombs falling, they could feel the ground shake.
Right now in Israel, there's a lot of management on what Israelis actually hear about the experience of people held in captivity in the Gaza Strip. But what little comes out shows that there is at least some sort of humane treatment of these Israelis. And I think that that's important to also register because it contrasts with the current paradigm that Israel has used in its prisons, using isolation, the deprivation of food, lack of sleep, stress positions. Prisoners are coming out having lost tens of kilograms. And the picture that we're getting is largely from Palestinian prisoners coming from the West Bank and not from Gaza, because prisoners of Gaza are suffering even more brutality. They're made to bark. They're always shackled. Almost 36 Palestinian prisoners from Gaza have been killed under these severe conditions.
Under Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel has intensified its occupation and apartheid. And since October last year, it has been carrying out what has been deemed a plausible genocide of Palestinians. Netanyahu and his political greed have been central to all this. In his nearly 2 decades at the heart of government, he has manipulated and massaged the system to keep himself in power, allying with ever more extreme political actors and dominating the narrative in a way that means no dirt ever really sticks, be it corruption, moral depravity, or a narcissistic agenda that is to the detriment of the nation. Even now, with so many in Israel blaming him for the disastrous war and the untenable hostage situation, Netanyahu has made the rescue all about himself.
Haaretz published an editorial cartoon by the inimitable Amos Biderman that shows a military helicopter with a pilot, and next to the pilot in the passenger seat is Noah Agamon, who's one of the most well-known hostages taken on October 7th. And Netanyahu is waving, and the caption is, "I'm responsible," meaning I take credit.
The fact is that the majority of Israelis support Netanyahu's policies. They may not like him, they may not like his personal conduct, But the context which Netanyahu exploits very well is to constantly tell his people,
אם נצטרך לעמוד לבד, נעמוד לבד. אמרתי כבר שאם צריך נילחם בציפורניים, אבל יש לנו הרבה יותר מאשר ציפורניים. ובאותן תעצומות נפש, בעזרת השם, יחד ננצח.
And to do this we have to teach the Palestinians a lesson in Gaza that they'll never forget and carry out this genocide. And the majority of Israelis say, yes, go ahead, we're with you.
I think it would be fair to say that the continuation of the current Netanyahu government threatens Israel's survival much more than any military force that exists right now. The greatest threat to Israel's survival is the ongoing occupation. The forces that Netanyahu is aligned with are the forces that want to see not just the occupation perpetuated, but it basically made permanent. They want to see the annexation of the West Bank and Gaza and the expulsion of the Palestinians there. If they get their way, that will be the end of Israel. And whether they get their way depends a lot on whether Netanyahu stays in power.
In Israel's neighboring state, Jordan, unrest has been brewing for months against the backdrop of the assault on Gaza. There have been mass protests and political posturing from the ruling family. And now we're seeing journalists being singled out. Ryan Coles has more.
After her arrest last month, Jordanian journalist Hiba Abu Taha was sentenced this week by a court in Amman to a year in prison, becoming the first high-profile target of a controversial new cybercrime law. Authorities weren't forthcoming on how exactly Abu Taha broke the law, but the arrest came days after she published an article in a Lebanese online outlet titled "The Role of the Jordanian State in Protecting the Enemy Occupier." In it, she tore into Jordan's authorities for allowing the passage of fuel shipments to Israel and for the military's role in intercepting Iranian drones and missiles aimed at Tel Aviv. Abu Taha, like millions of Jordanians, is of Palestinian descent. She has been arrested twice before for her work. But this time it's clear, given the hefty prison sentence, she's hit an especially sore spot for the government. Since October 7th, King Abdullah has been busy engaging in dramatic photo ops and military exercises, including airdropping aid over the Gaza Strip, all to emphasize that Jordan is an opponent of Israel, an ally to the Palestinian cause. Meanwhile, the anger on the streets of Amman has been palpable. Millions protested against the war and what's widely perceived as the complicity of the Jordanian state. Authorities responded with arrests of not only protesters, but academics, activists, and journalists discussing the protests online, all thanks to that cybercrime law, which, conveniently for the Jordanian government, was passed weeks before October 7th.
And it's come in handy for them ever since. Thanks, Ryan. Since its inception in the 1950s, Italy's national broadcaster RAI has grappled with a conundrum. The network is owned in large part by the state. It is funded in large part by the public through a tax. And that's where the tension has been. Should RAI serve as political masters in government or the people of Italy and the public interest? Successive leaders have promised to break the network free of this tangle, but have never delivered. For the nearly 2 years that Giorgia Meloni's right-wing government has been in power, there's been a squeeze on the media in general and RAI in particular. From the cancelling of critical voices to a slew of resignations, the censoring of stories and the placement of pro-government people in key positions. Insiders say the situation has never been this bleak. Those who spoke with us for this report did so on the condition we hide their identity. The Listening Post's Tarek Nafa now, from Rome, on the faltering independence of Italy's national broadcaster and the broader implications for democratic discourse and media freedom in Italy.
In Italy, a debate is raging about the Prime Minister's domination over public broadcaster RAI, which her critics have dubbed Tele Meloni.
Ciao a tutti e ben ritrovati.
So in late May, Giorgia Meloni took to social media to confront her opponents by trolling them.
Quindi eccomi qui in una nuova puntata degli appunti di Giorgia, che però ho deciso di ribattezzare Tele Meloni. Perché l'unica delle Meloni che esiste è questa. Tutto il resto sono fake news di una sinistra che, essendo abituata a occupare la televisione, pensa che gli altri siano come lei.
By teasing her critics, the Prime Minister is twisting the narrative in her favor. Unfortunately, Tele Meloni is real. In Rai News 24, where I work, our director is a renowned Meloni supporter. Recently, we've seen Meloni speeches transmitted live in full. in one particularly outrageous case for 46 minutes straight, without any kind of journalistic examination whatsoever.
Italy's Prime Minister says it openly. She thinks it's time for Rai to change. Previous governments locked Meloni's party, Fratelli d'Italia, out of the governance of the public broadcaster. And now the far-right ruling coalition wants to redress what they see as historic left-wing bias. Journalists we've spoken to at Rai insist what is happening goes far beyond balance. They say Meloni and her allies are out to seize control of the network, bend it to their will, and purge or sideline anyone who gets in the way. Which is why all the journalists we've spoken to have asked to remain either anonymous or off the record.
Among ourselves, we journalists say that this government is taking no prisoners, which is to say that they are placing people loyal to them in all key roles in a methodical manner. You can see it in our newsrooms, in our programs and news bulletins. It leaves less and less space for voices tied to the opposition.
People talk about this as though political interference in Rai has only just begun, but it's always been there. What I'm seeing today is the same I've seen in previous years. There's a lot of politics, a lot of opportunism. Perhaps those who've only just realized Rai is under government control were asleep years ago. Or maybe they're just filing their complaints 8 years too late.
The editorial makeup of Rai has always been political because of what is called lottizzazione, the divvying up of the network's most important jobs among different political parties. Broadly speaking, Rai Uno has tended to be pro-government, Rai Due centre-right, and Rai Tre centre-left. In 2015, centre-left Prime Minister Matteo Renzi introduced a new position at the top, a CEO with broad decision-making powers. That was meant to end the domination by politicians, but seemingly only made things worse. Less than a year after Meloni came to power, then CEO Carlo Fortes said he was forced to resign under pressure from her government. He was replaced with Roberto Sergio, whose political stance, Italian media have reported, changes with the wind. Rai also got a new Director General, Gianpaolo Rossi, who is staunchly pro-Meloni and has a history of racist and pro-fascist views.
Rai has always been used by political parties, but at least before we had a fair play of sorts between the parliamentary majority and the opposition. This fair play agreement is gone. This is outright appropriation. It's a very different situation. What we have is a single party that manages 3 separate channels.
There are a lot of stories we weren't allowed to report on. There are certain stories we won't even pitch anymore because we know they'll get rejected by an editor. Obviously, it isn't the Prime Minister herself intervening in Rai's editorial choices, but clearly a whole system of supervision has been set up by Rai's governance, which serves as a control filter. Even satire. Satire was often at the heart of many Rai programs' success. It's gone, because it's no longer permitted to harshly criticize those who are in power.
If you look at our coverage of Gaza, for example, because the government is supporting Israel so unequivocally,
Ad un bar è da un anno, buonasera, è da un anno ambasciatore di Israele in Italia. Questa è l'occasione per rinnovare la nostra antica solidarietà.
there is a lot of pressure from editors and various executives to tone down certain terms. When discussing the ongoing massacres in Gaza, journalists are asked not to use certain words to soften the language. I have never seen this level of censorship and manipulation as with this story. If you speak out against it, the only result is that the system expels and marginalizes you.
At every level of Rai's management, there are changes happening that suit the government's narrative. In May, the Broadcasters' Union of Journalists, USIG Rai, organized a strike to protest stifling control by Meloni's government they said was turning Rai into a mouthpiece.
Preferiamo perdere uno o più giorni di paga che perdere la nostra libertà.
One of the reasons Rai was able to stay on the air during the walkout is because of a new counter-union set up last year, Unirai, whose members kept working.
They describe themselves as an alternative pluralist union, and it just so happens that all the senior managers who were recently promoted are members of this union. Unirai basically carries out a lobbying function rather than safeguarding workers' rights. It is lobbying to advance a particular narrative and to advance the careers of a specific group of people.
Francesco Palese is the secretary of the new union, Unirai.
Abbiamo fatto nascere.
We have given birth to this new trade union in order to represent all of Rai's journalists. All too often, Rai's historic trade union has been the mouthpiece of a single line of thought. To these anonymous colleagues who call us scabs, and to those who see us as a trade union that's controlled by the board, that is a very serious accusation. If they have evidence of this, let them report us. Otherwise, this is nothing more than defamation.
Diffamazione.
There are also journalists who don't strike because they're afraid. These are the people who won't be interviewed, not even anonymously. It's just like Italy under fascism. It's not that all Italians were fascists, but many went along with it out of fear.
Rai is just one front in Prime Minister Meloni's battle to remake Italy. She says she wants to liberate Italian culture from the hegemony of a left-wing elite. Part of that effort involves rewriting Italian history. Ministers in Meloni's government have celebrated the achievements of fascism, while whitewashing violent episodes from Italy's past, like its colonial rule in Africa.
Gli italiani, sia nel periodo pre-fascismo, sia durante il fascismo, nei suoi 100 anni di colonie, in Africa ha costruito e realizzato. Noi invece abbiamo una cultura civilizzatrice.
Italy has never truly confronted its history of fascism. You still see monuments to the fascist era all over Rome. Prime Minister Meloni has at times tried to excuse the fascist crimes of the past. She wants Italians to be at ease with their history because it helps justify the vision she has for Italy today.
The objective here is not just about taking politics toward the right. It's also about a change in the culture by rewriting history. We have to face up to it. There's always been censorship. Italian history is not especially marked by liberalism. We have to admit that.
A country without freedom of the press is a country that cannot be democratic. Rai has been hijacked by a single point of view, one that promotes traditional family values, Catholic values, patriotism, and makes a great show of anything that is linked to the institutions, to the army. How can anyone understand what's really going on in the country when the accepted narrative of events is so singular, so unquestionable, when there is no criticism, no right to criticize?
And finally, for students of critical theory, and those of us who interrogate the media are, the silence of a particular voice on the big events taking place globally right now will not have gone unnoticed. Noam Chomsky, the American linguist, anti-war activist, and importantly, the co-author of the book, Manufacturing Consent, has always been outspoken on power, oppression, and when the media fail to fulfill their duty. This past week, Chomsky's family said his silence has been because he is deeply unwell and in hospital. Chomsky is 95. He hasn't always got it right, but his influence on generations of people around the world holding power to account has been phenomenal. The hope is he recovers his health. Until then, this moment is as good a time as any to either introduce yourself to Manufacturing Consent or reread it. It remains as relevant as ever. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.